Hello, my friends. Welcome to another chapter in the Range Running Chronicles Revolver series. I am glad that you dropped in to visit. Listen closely. Can you identify this sound? Let's hear that again. Listen close now. If you said that was the cocking and decocking clicks of a Colt 1873 Single-Action Army revolver, you are a true single-action revolver aficionado. Stay tuned, because I am going to tell you all about one. Colt clicks, as they have come to be known, were not always present in Colt single-action revolvers. Colt single-action revolvers began life in 1836 with the Colt Patterson, a percussion revolver that brought revolvers into mainstream use. Followed in 1847 with Colt Walker, a very heavy and bulky horse pistol. Popularity of revolvers grew into a series of dragoons and other revolvers, both in percussion and cartridge versions, until the failure of the 1872 Colt open-top revolver to be accepted by the U.S. military. This led to the iconic 1873 Colt Single-Action Army revolver, and to the highly recognizable Colt clicks, stages of the hammer, while it was being pulled to the full cock position. The Colt Single-Action Army under review today is the New Frontier model, and which was manufactured in 1962 by all serial number indications. It would be nearly 70 years since 1873 before Colt tried to improve the single-action. The perfect single-action Army became even more perfect. Colt decided to upgrade the single-action Army and call it the New Frontier. The mainframe was given a heavy flat top and fitted with an adjustable rear sight, matched up with a ramp front sight. The frame, including the new flat top, was beautifully case-colored, and the balance was finished in what Colt called royal blue. The original New Frontiers, now known as second generation, were offered in .45 Colt, .357 Magnum, .44 Special, and even more rare, a .38 Special. Barrel lengths were 4 3/4 inch, 5 1/2 inch, and 7 1/2 inch, though not offered in all chamberings. This fine example, provided by my son-in-law for review, is chambered in .45 Colt and has a 4 3/4 inch barrel. All of these second-generation single-actions were removed from production in the early 1970s and came back a few years later as the third generation. These New Frontiers are the most beautifully finished factory-produced Colt single-actions, not only as to finish, consisting of a case-hardened frame matched up with a highly polished blue barrel and cylinder, but they are also exceptionally well-fitted with no sharp edges. Running a finger over the seams reveals a nice smooth transition between sub-assemblies. Before I get to the particulars, let me run through some specifications, some of which are established, and most of which are from my own measurements. For the finer points of the revolver, let me begin at the beginning, the muzzle end, and work around to the trigger. The perfectly crowned muzzle blends into a very large hole that says, "This end is all about business." Chambered in .45 Colt, that hole in the barrel says "Big Bore" at whatever angle you look at it. Just above that very big hole is a very tall front sight with a very long serrated ramp. The upper sight serrations are highlighted in yellow for visibility, and I am assuming that this was applied post-sales. The highlighting does help to see the front sight when viewed from the rear sight, which I will get into in a bit. The barrel, from tip to where it meets the frame, is beautifully done, highly polished blued steel. Markings on the barrel only include Colt New Frontier SAA 45 on the left side, with no markings on the right side, but which is a full-length extractor rod housing and is co-joined with the barrel. That fully encloses a small button-type extractor rod and return spring. The top of the barrel markings include the source of manufacturer. The extractor rod button rotates up slightly, and when pushed or pulled to the rear, has substantial length to fully push expended .45 Colt shell casings completely clear of the frame. Atop the color case hardened steel frame, which is a very thick top strap, is the fully adjustable for windage and elevation rear sight. The rear sight is flat black, with no sighting aid, but a small notch to view the front sight. No dots, no outlines, no serrations to cut glare, just flat black. There is clearance on each side of the notch for which to view the front sight, but the clearance is very slight. In the middle of the frame is the cylinder, capable of holding up to 6 .45 Colt cartridges. The cylinder is also a highly polished blued steel affair that contrasts nicely against the color case hardened frame and is substantial in girth and weight. The ever-present cylinder to forcing cone gap, the flash gap, measures out at 0.04 of an inch. There is barely perceptible side and end play with the cylinder, but both are within acceptable limits. When in full lockup, there is absolutely no cylinder end play. There will always be some side play, but again, it is well within acceptable limits. But what rotates the cylinder? That is the operation of the hammer and internal components, coupled with the cylinder ratchet, or star, as it is sometimes referred to. Timing on this example is impeccable, as would be expected of a revolver of this nature and by this manufacturer. Getting back to the Colt clicks, there are 4. The first, when the hammer is pulled to the safety notch, at which the hammer will not drop when the trigger is pulled. The second click is at the loading-unloading notch. That again, the hammer will not drop when the trigger is pulled. And speaking of loading and unloading, just behind the cylinder on the frame is the loading and unloading gate. This also color case hardened to match the frame loading and unloading gate can be opened and closed at any time. However, unlike modern Ruger single-action revolvers, you cannot load or unload the firearm with just the gate open. To load or unload the firearm, not only must the gate be open, but the hammer must be in the half-cock position. Now, let's move into that third hammer position. This is a pass-through click, as the hammer will not lock at this point. The hammer will return to the loading-unloading notch if allowed to be slowly lowered with the thumb. The fourth and final click is the full cock position. Here the hammer is held until released by the trigger, whether the hammer is forced to fall through firing the revolver, or if the hammer is slowly lowered, as in decocking, with the thumb when pulling the trigger. I'll talk about decocking the revolver a bit later in the presentation. You may or may not have noticed that the cylinder rotates to the right, as most, if not all, Colt revolvers do, even reproductions of, in most cases. Note that there is no hammer block or transfer bar safety on this example. And while I am on the subject of the hammer is a wide, mildly serrated affair with a deep valley for which to place the thumb. The hammer spur juts outward to provide the best surface to cocking or decocking the firearm. The full motion of the hammer is very long and comes to rest in the full cock position well into the web of the shooting hand, assuming that a high hold is taken on the grip, as would normally be taken with this revolver. The hammer spur is very high, which would negate using a Bisley grip with the revolver. The Colt Bisley, if you do not know, had a lowered hammer spur that could be easily reached with the thumb. This revolver, with its high hammer spur, was intended to be pulled while the revolver was in anywhere from a shoot from the waist or a shoot at eye level attitude. The Bisley hold was a competition-style hold, where the revolver was only fired at eye level with the wrist and elbow bent. However, that's not to say that the Bisley was not used outside of competition. In fact, the Bisley became popular with a number of folks, both within and outside of the law. One of the key features of the Bisley was the grip, which leads me to the grip of this revolver. The grip design of the 1873 Single-Action Army was borrowed from the 1860 Army percussion revolver. The grip was wider and longer than other grips and was favored by many. The curvature of the backstrap agreed with most hands, while the inward flare of the front strap helped keep the fingers on the grip. This example follows the same curvatures as the original 1873 Single-Action Army. The grip handles on this piece are genuine Colt grips with genuine Colt medallions on each panel, perfectly mated to the grip frame. These stag grips seem to be the real thing. I don't know if that's true or not, but I am not about to remove them to see. The texture and color of these panels are darn near perfect. The right side panel is relieved as would naturally be found on real staghorn grips, and actually bothers my hand somewhat. This area of relieved material falls right under where my little finger would be placed on the grip. It actually feels better to me to roll my little finger under the grip rather than to place it on the grip. Darn, those grip panels do look great. The grip length is just a shy short of allowing all of my fingers being on the grip, unless I get an extremely high hold on a revolver, which I like to do anyway. Putting the little finger just under the grip helps to keep the revolver from rolling in the hand when it is fired. Any single-action revolver has muzzle flip. The more powerful the cartridge being fired, the more the muzzle lift. This is due to the natural high-bore axis of the single-action revolver. The .45 Colt cartridge can provide substantial muzzle flip when fired. This causes a downward roll at the back of the revolver, which can make the grip roll in the hand if not controlled. Having the little finger at the underside of the grip and keeping both the wrist and arm straight can mitigate some, if not all, of this rolling effect. But you just may catch an example of that when I get to the range session. Rolling upward on the left side of the frame, you will see Colt patent numbers that, in this case, include the dates of September 19, 1871, July 2nd, 72, and January 19, 75. The serial number is located on the bottom of the frame, just forward of the trigger guard assembly. The trigger guard and grip are one integrated unit, and which is attached to the frame via 5 screws, one at the front of the trigger guard, 2 just behind the trigger guard, and 2 at the rear of the frame alongside the hammer well. I can tell you that these screws have not been bothered since leaving the factory many moons ago. Within the trigger guard, which is rounded, smooth, and small, is a petite-sized trigger. Just enough material to call it a trigger, it is highly curved and smooth in surface texture. This firearm is, after all, a single-action revolver, and not much trigger surface is needed, just enough to get your belly button lint removing finger on it. Trigger pull weight came in at 2 pounds, 6.2 ounces, with a 5-pull average. There is just a hint of play before the hammer drops, but when the hammer does drop, it is with authority, with absolutely no over travel. While it is not the smoothest single-action trigger I have ever pulled, it is acceptable and within single-action factory standards. At this point, and unless you have a question, I think that it is time to move on to checking this beauty out before I take it to the range. So that's where I am heading to next. Performing maintenance on these single-action revolvers is actually pretty enjoyable. Of course, the first thing is a safety check. Open the loading and unloading gate by rolling it outward. Pull the hammer to the half-cock notch, which you will note unlocks the cylinder, and then rotate each chamber several times to ensure that no live ammunition is present. Leave the hammer in the half-cock position and the loading-unloading gate outward. To release the cylinder, locate the cylinder release and lock button on the left side of the frame. Just in front of the cylinder release and lock button is the cylinder rod, or pin, as it is sometimes called. Push the cylinder release and lock button in to unlock the cylinder rod, all while supporting the cylinder. While holding the cylinder release and lock button in, pull the cylinder rod out and away from the frame. You will feel the cylinder release when the cylinder rod unlocks. Continue to support the cylinder while continuing to press inward on the cylinder release and lock button, and pulling out the cylinder rod. Eventually, the cylinder rod will come free from the frame and the cylinder will drop right into your hand, if you supported the cylinder. If you did not support the cylinder may drop onto your workbench, roll off the workbench onto the floor, and roll to parts unknown. Plus, you just might mar that beautiful polished blue finish of the cylinder. That would be considered gun abuse. Clean and inspect as needed. During my inspection of this piece, I noticed that the tip of the hand had chipped, and the edge was looking pretty ragged where it meets each cocking notch in the star. Although this Colt has the usual scrapes and nicks that could be associated with a firearm 62 years old, I felt that this wear to the hand was out of place. I let my son-in-law know about it, and he can decide what to do about it. I think that it will be fine for a few rounds that I'm going to put through it, but I am not going to push it. To assemble the cylinder to the frame, ensure that the hammer is in the half-cock position and the loading-unloading gate is out. Gently place the cylinder into the frame. A slight rocking motion will make a cylinder notch to the tip of the hand in the frame. Be gentle in your approach. And now that I think of it, someone may not have been so gentle when installing the cylinder into the frame, which may have caused the damage to the tip of the hand. Don't force it. cylinder will find its way into place when it's ready, and not before. Once the cylinder is installed and flush with the frame, and while supporting the cylinder, push the cylinder pin into the frame. It will stop at the cylinder pin lock and release button. Push the cylinder rod lock and release button in until you can push the cylinder pin into the frame. Continue pushing the cylinder pin lock and release button in while pushing the cylinder pin in, while gently and slightly moving the cylinder until the cylinder pin locks into place. You will both feel and hear it when it does. Rotate the cylinder to ensure that no binding occurs. If it's good, close the loading and unloading gate, pull the hammer to the full cock position, and now let me tell you how to properly decock the firearm. You can place either thumb on top of the hammer, no matter which, as the thumb will control the descent of the hammer. Pull the hammer slightly to the rear. Pull the trigger while supporting the hammer. Keep the trigger pressed all the way. With the thumb holding the hammer, slowly release the hammer in a controlled descent until it rests fully into the frame. You may feel the hammer as it passes by the half cock and quarter cock positions. Just keep going. Release the trigger and all is done. Now, on to the function check. As usual, I use snap caps when try firing any firearm. This Colt has a floating firing pin in the hammer. When the hammer drops, it drops into a well within the frame that guides the tip of the firing pin to the center opening where it impacts the primer. Using a snap cap protects the firing pin from damage. Enough said. Install a snap cap into each of the chambers. Pull the hammer to the first click. Gently pull the trigger. The hammer should not fall. Pull the hammer to the second click, the loading and unloading point. Gently pull the trigger. The hammer again should not fall. Pull the hammer to the full cock position. You will hear and feel when the cylinder locking lug falls into a cylinder locking detent. The hammer should be locked back at the full cock position. At the full cock hammer position, and only at the full cock position, pull the trigger. The hammer will fall, and the firing pin will strike the snap cap. Cycle the action from the full cock position several times to ensure that it's firing on all cylinders, or chambers in this case. Now, while I had you pull the trigger when the hammer was in the first or second click position, you should never try to decock the revolver from these positions. Always use the full cock position to decock the revolver. Now, if you do happen to pull and quickly release the trigger while slowly allowing the hammer to fall forward, the hammer will stop at the second notch, the loading-unloading notch. If you pull the trigger again, the hammer will remain at this position. Again, the hammer must be fully cocked to decock the revolver. Obviously, and for safety reasons, the revolver should be decocked with empty chambers. There may be a time, however, where it might be necessary to decock the revolver with live ammunition loaded. Decocking, in this case, must be performed with extreme care, as the firing pin can set off a live round if bumped hard enough, because the New Frontier does not have a safety mechanism, such as a transfer bar or hammer block safety. If the firearm is loaded with live ammunition, it is highly advised that you decock only to the second notch, load and unload hammer position. Unload the firearm, and then decock the firearm from the full cock position. Since this fine Colt New Frontier does not have a hammer block or a transfer bar safety. It is to be loaded the old-fashioned way, with only 5 chambers loaded. That means load 1 chamber, skip a chamber, load the next 4 chambers, and then close the loading gate. The hammer is pulled to the full cock position, and the revolver is decocked so that the firing pin rests on an empty chamber. This is my standard way of loading any single-action revolver, even those that do have a hammer block or a transfer bar safety. It just keeps me consistent in my loading practices. Your way may differ, and that's fine. Just be aware of the risk. So, let's pick up on my shooting and see how the Colt New Frontier and I are doing. Having shot quite a few Colt Single-Action Army reproductions by Uverity, I was really looking forward to shooting a real Colt Single-Action Army, even one like the New Frontier model. This second-generation Colt Single-Action Army went through quite a few improvements, thicker top straps, and a more robust construction. Although not a Magnum revolver, 45 Colt would easily handle loads using 260 grain key-style bullets at 1,000 to 1,150 feet per second. I am not even getting close to that today. Cowboy loads and my son-in-law's hand loads fit the bill just fine. As was mentioned in the features segment, any single-action revolver has muzzle flip. The more powerful the cartridge being fired, the more muzzle lift. This is due to the natural high-bore axis of the single-action revolver. The 45 Colt cartridge can provide substantial muzzle flip when fired. This causes a downward roll at the back of the revolver, which can make the grip roll in the hand if not controlled. Having the little finger at the underside of the grip and keeping both the wrist and arm straight can mitigate some, if not all, of this rolling effect. You just may catch an example of that in this range session. Back in the shadows of my brain lies the fact that the cylinder hand on this revolver is slightly damaged, as found while inspecting the revolver in the maintenance segment. For that reason, I am not going to put an abundance of ammunition through it, just enough for demonstrating to myself and to you that this Colt New Frontier actually functions. I'll put a few cylinders through of cowboy loads and my son-in-law's hand loads through it, and call it a day. The new Colt Frontier models are gone forever, but one can hope that they will return. The new Frontier model was considered the premium of all Colt single-action revolvers. Today, only 3 Colt single-action revolvers are listed on the Colt website. All are in .45 Colt caliber and sport a 7.5, 4 3/4, and 5-inch barrel. This review brought to my hands a very fine example of a second-generation Colt Single-Action Army revolver, a new Frontier model built in 1962. I appreciate my son-in-law for providing this example to review, and because of that, I got to handle and shoot this one, and you got to view one of the finest Colt single-action revolvers ever made. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, as it is time to close yet another chapter in the Range Ronin Chronicles Revolver series. This series won't be closed for long, though, and I hope that you will return for the next one, and also my quick view and At the Range series. Until we meet again, be vigilant, be armed, and be safe out there.